I think I really gravitate to pitches that are made to me that actually contain some aspect of a storytelling idea.
Hey everyone, it's Arick Wierson with the inaugural episode of Leverage Storytelling, brought to you by Tunheim. Today I'm joined by Shelley Kohan, my good friend here in town from New York. Shelley, thanks for being on the podcast.
I am so excited to be here with you today.
Now, Shelley, just for everyone's benefit, you're a professor at the School of Business and Technology at FIT in New York City. You are a senior contributor to Forbes. You wear many different hats.
That's right.
Today we're going to talk about storytelling. And I think that, what we're trying to do in this podcast, what I've been doing in the blog, is introducing people to different ways in which they can get their stories told, the different techniques for getting stories to connect with viewers or listeners. So talk to me a little bit about, how did you become a storyteller?
That's so interesting. So yes, I have a lot of expert experience in the retail industry. And through that, I started working for a technology company. And in my work with the technology company, I was often put as a spokesperson to talk to the industry about what was happening. And from there, I actually started writing and doing podcasts. And, that kind of started my storytelling part of my career. So I have a weekly podcast called Retail Unwrapped. And then, like you said, I'm a senior contributor at Forbes.com. So it's been great.
I'm sure you get pitched all the time by companies that want to get covered in Forbes. And obviously, I'm sure you look at some of them. I'm sure there's too many to actually go through with a fine-tooth comb. But tell me, how is that process? How do you decide what you're going to write about or what you're going to ignore?
Well, so it's interesting. So I get pitched all the time. And the ones that I usually ignore right away are like press releases, because that's something everyone gets.
Press releases are dead, basically, right?
Yeah. I mean, everyone gets it. And unless you're going to add to the story, it's really not a story. I think I really gravitate to pitches that are made to me that actually contain some aspect of a storytelling idea. So just saying, hey, do you want to interview this person? Not that interesting. But I have some people that actually pitch to me, I have this great story. Here's what's happening. Here's some data points. And then that becomes more interesting. So, and I also think about what interests me and what's going to interest my readers.
Tell me, so how broad are your swim lanes at Forbes? I mean, you're obviously a retail guru. You talk about everything from, home products to consumer electronics to fashion and apparel, beauty. But within, is it broader than that? Or how do you sort of define those swim lanes?
Well, retail is like a $7 trillion industry in the U.S., so that's pretty broad. So I'm in retail, and I can talk about and write about and storytell all things retail. So typically my stories are going to have some type of retail focus in them. And that's kind of what my swim lane is.
Now, if someone were to pitch you on, say, hey, I've got something that's happening in the supply chain of retail, does that?
Absolutely. That's part of retail. Absolutely. I've actually written a lot about supply chain.
And then tell me, and this is for people that are listening to this podcast that are saying, hey, I'd love to get covered. I got a great story. I'd love to be covered by Forbes, for example. They think they should be in Forbes. What's the best way to sort of pitch you then if they're not going to, it's not a press release, if they want to give you the exclusive, talk about that process.
Yeah. So usually people will reach out to me and they'll say, hey, I got this great story. Here's kind of the topic of the story. Here are a few points that would be interesting. And here's why it's important.
Do they keep it short? Does it keep it like a...
Oh, definitely keep it short. And
how many, 100 words? 50 words?
Well, you can have more than 100 words, but, just a short pitch about what's the story, why is it important, and what are some of the key points around it. And I think that's where I really gravitate to interesting stories to write about.
I've talked to, a number of reporters over the past 4 or 5 years, in New York and other major cities that are getting constantly put under more pressure to produce more content with less time to produce that content. So I know people, for example, in certain outlets that, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, were having to write 2 stories a day, sometimes 3 stories a day of like 400 to 600 words. And suddenly now they're having to do double duty. Do you have sort of a certain sort of metric or output that you're looking to do, or is it more kind of, it's up to you, it's your discretion?
Well, it's kind of up to me and my discretion. Forbes.com likes me to write as much as I can because people like my stories and they like reading them. But I'll tell you where the best stories come from. The best stories come from when I actually interview someone, and I'll tell you why. So oftentimes when people like pitch me a story, they'll pitch a story with a certain set of parameters. When I interview people, all of a sudden we're having a great conversation and we go off on this side trail. And that becomes the best part of the story, the unknown, part of the story that wasn't really pitched up front. And those make the best stories. Those kind of just, you go down this journey of a story with someone that you're interviewing, and it becomes a great, part of the story.
When you talk to CEOs or other C-level executives of these big companies, what is it that you find most compelling about those conversations? Is it how they got there? Is it what their plans are for the future? Where do you tend to focus your storytelling?
Yeah, so the first thing I always do when I'm interviewing like a CEO or any executive is I always do my research ahead of time. And I don't ask them or talk about anything that I can get myself through the research. And that's probably an obvious aspect of it.
But that's not necessarily going to be obvious to the person who's listening or watching the interview, right?
No, but not watching her, but a lot of us who write will try to stick to the parts of the story that aren't readily available. And so when I'm speaking to a CEO, I will ask them, if sales have been good, I will congratulate them on the great revenue or the great profits. If sales haven't been good, I probably don't say anything about that. I kind of leave that off because I want to create this nice relationship with the interview process. If I do focus on the leadership skills a lot, so I gravitate to asking, how leaders lead or what they do or why is it important. And I always focus on, what can we expect from you next or the company next. So I do a little bit of, what's happening now. If there's a particular topic that I'm interviewing them about, getting details about that topic, a strategy they just announced, a collaboration they just announced, and then what can we expect from that company in the future.
And how do you keep it interesting? So these CEOs, sometimes you're the 7th of 15 interviews they're doing in a junket. How do you keep your interview interesting and memorable?
The way that I keep it interesting and memorable is, 1, I don't ask them anything I can find myself, and 2, I make it fun for them. Anybody wants to have fun, when they're being interviewed. So I try to keep it fun and I try to keep it, personable. And I think by doing that, when I reach out to these CEOs, they're more apt to say, oh yeah, I enjoy talking to Shelley, so let's do that interview. And keep it short too.
And what's the construct? Do you have like a framework? Do you think of it as a 3-act play? Do you set something up? Conflict resolution? How did you solve it? And how do you structure your interviews?
Thank you for asking. That's actually a 4-act play. So in a 20-minute interview, I try to keep my interviews to 20 minutes. The reason I do that is because 30 minutes gets too long. 40 minutes, you've lost the listener. So I try. The sweet spot for me is like 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And I usually do it for what I like to say is 4 big topics. So we're going to cover these 4 big topics. And then here are the sub-points under those 4 big topics. So I try to stick to 4 big topics. That's kind of the secret sauce to my writing and interviewing.
Now, one of the other hats that you wear is that of a professor.
Yes.
And that's an entirely different type of storytelling. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So storytelling, what's interesting about storytelling as a professor is I love stories that the students help in that journey of storytelling. And what I mean by that is if I'm teaching a particular strategy or I'm teaching a particular discipline or trying to teach students something, I like to ask students questions, and then through their answers, that helps me then create the story for them. And sometimes students, I am so, I'm into the industry so much that sometimes I have to, in my professor role, I have to backtrack a little bit and really start from the beginning of a story with students, whereas, when I'm doing interviews and stuff, that's not necessarily what I need to do. But I like involving the students because they help create a journey or a story that's more interesting than me just coming out and lecturing for 45 minutes.
Before we got on this podcast, we were talking about Abercrombie and Fitch, and
yes.
you were remarking to me that it was a brand that had gone through its trials and tribulations some years ago and was sort of off the radar. And suddenly, because of your students, you realized that it was back in vogue and it was a brand that was hot again with, Gen Z and tell me a little bit about how the students actually inform your writing for Forbes or some of the other things that you're doing.
It's great. Yeah. So at the beginning of every semester, I ask students, who are your favorite retailers? And so they tell me 3 or 4 retailers that are their favorite retailers. Every student has to do this. And so one year I had a set of students come up and they're like, oh, our favorite retailer is Abercrombie and Fitch. And I'm like, oh, that's weird. I haven't heard that in like a couple years. And then, 2 students later, there's another student. Oh, my favorite retailer is Abercrombie and Fitch. And then it happened again and again and again, this one class. So what I did was I ran with it. So after all the introductions were done, I then went to the class and said, guys, I got to ask you, what's with Abercrombie and Fitch? And then this great discussion took place with the students about they're doing things great, their jeans are great, I love the company. I'm like, wow. And the best part of the story is that back in the back of the classroom, this one little student raises her hand and she goes, I wasn't going to say this, but my aunt is Fran Horowitz, who's the CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch. So that was just such a great dynamic storytelling moment for me, unplanned, unstructured, and just on the fly.
We today took a tour, you and I, earlier this morning at the Mall of America, which is just down the road here from Tunheim. And we went into a store that is launched, basically it was a TikTok brand. And now it has its first brick and mortar presence. I think it's the first one and the only one in the United States or in the world. Could you talk a little bit about this trend of social media and retail and how those two sort of hitherto separate disciplines are sort of colliding right now?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So social media has become the brand influencers for a lot of, clothing brands or retail. And it really resonates with Gen Alpha and Gen Z. And they've actually become the new celebrities. So these influencers are the new celebrities. And it's great because the digital native brands, now we have so many different digital native brands that otherwise would not have been as successful if they didn't have platforms like Instagram or TikTok. So it's been a lot of fun. And the other thing I noticed when we did our tour of Mall of America is that you looked at Addicted, which was the TikTok brand that opened up the pop-up store in Mall of America, and I walked through the store and it was vibrant, it was fun, the fixtures were fun, there were great visuals all over the wall, and I think, wow, this is a lot of fun, I get this. And then I would go into maybe another store that has been around for a long time, and I walk in, it's like, oh, this seems dated, this seems like, it's always been for the past 10 years. So the word to the wise is brands got to really level up what they're doing in the physical retail space, because when these digital brands do these little pop-up shops and stuff, they're really attacking it in a very experiential way.
What have you found? I mean, retail brands by their very nature are supposed to be connected with the end consumer. That's their core business. But a lot of brands have really not, even though we're 10 years, 15 years, if you want to count Facebook and some of these others, into the social media era, they still struggle to figure out how to leverage this new medium. Maybe you could reflect a little bit on that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the challenges is that how do you use the social media to drive and build engagement? And that's what you have to do. It's not looking at these social media platforms on how can we market or sell more things. What you really want to approach it as is how do I become very authentic with my audience to drive deeper engagement? And by the way, the result of doing that gets you those other two things, which is, higher engagement and It also gets you more sales and deeper loyalty, all the things you want to do, but you have to really use social media as an authentic play with your target market.
It's sort of a bank shot, right?
Yes,
and I think that's one of the
exactly.
things that a lot of chief marketing officers struggle with, right? Because it's already hard. There's a cemetery full of CMOs that have gone to the grave not knowing how to measure ROI in marketing,
Right.
and now it's a bank shot, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So tell me a little bit more about how your students, inform some of your storytelling. You gave the example of Abercrombie & Fitch. We talked about, some of these digital brands that are, digital brands that are now, moving into the physical space. How else does having this contact with the youngest generation of consumers, how else does that impact and affect what you're doing?
They keep me on my toes. I mean, they literally keep me on my toes. There's another example of we were doing Follow the Leader. It's an assignment I do in my leadership class. And I say, okay, what leader should we follow? So if I'm picking Brian Cornell and Doug McMillan and, all the big, guys that we all know that we follow all the time. And, sometimes I have students that are like, I want to follow, Terrence Riley of, Stanley Cup. And I'm like, really? Okay, we're a fashion school, but okay, talk to me.
Let's talk about Stanley. I think that's I think that's a terribly interesting story because, I'm someone who goes to a lot of conferences and events, and I'm always getting these Yeti cups. Right. And I think Yeti's a terrific brand, by the way. Yeti. I think it's well made and durable, and I always lose the caps, which is part of the reason that I got so many like capless, lidless Yetis at home.
Class.
Well, right. But suddenly, my 8-year-old, she comes home one day and she has to have a Stanley because all the girls in her class have Stanleys, and now we've bought like 6 Stanleys. And how did Stanley suddenly catapult into the forefront of these thermal mug space, if that's what it's called?
2 words: Terrence Riley.
Tell me about that.
Terrence Riley is the CMO of Stanley Cup now, but he came from Crocs. He's a marketing genius, and when he came to Stanley Cup, he kind of really just made Stanley Cup a household brand fashion. So let's think about what's transpired over the past few years. All of us, me included, I'm always walking around with my water bottle, right? We all want our water bottle and our drinks. And drinks, cups, and holders are fashion. So people are like, what? They're not fashion. It's, to hold water, but it's not. When I'm wearing this outfit, I want a, yellow container. When I'm wearing my purple outfit, I want a purple container. It's a fashion item. Stanley Cup caught on to that very quickly. They come out with their fashion colors. They come out with their, February Stanley Cups, and they also use social media. So coming from Crocs, that was a big thing that Terrence did with Crocs, is use social media. So it's a whole big... it's just a change of marketing in terms of, making a water cup mug a fashion. It's a fashion item.
I was talking a minute ago about my daughter who introduced me to that. I had always heard of Stanley, but I didn't associate it with anything special until, 6 months ago. The other thing that I think is really interesting is, she is sort of my barometer, which I would never think, because when I was 8 years old, I don't think I was thinking about anything related to fashion. But the other big thing that she's brought to my attention is how beauty has gone from something that was focused on maybe teenagers, young adult women, and now it's trickling down all the way to the younger generations. Younger in the sense that she's 8 years old, she's in 3rd grade, and she's also very, she understands different makeup brands and all this kind of stuff. What's happening in this space where it's younger and younger people are getting involved and paying attention to these things?
Well, I think one of the big changes, so Ulta Beauty came on the beauty scene over the past decade, and they've really done an amazing job. So they're in the neighborhoods, they're in the community, and what's interesting about Ulta Beauty specifically is they have this price range that goes from, low price drugstore brands up to high luxury brands. And so then they also have younger brands, and they have more established brands. So what that has done is now mom and daughter can shop together.
Oh, okay.
And so I think that's really changed the dynamic, and it's created kind of this social atmosphere for moms and daughters to shop together. I also believe that access is very important. And when you have, Ulta Beauty in the neighborhood store, right there within very close distance to where people are living, it becomes a quick pop in as opposed to going to a big mall or, it becomes like an everyday thing that you can just pop into Ulta Beauty, see what's happening. I think they've done a good job with really having all kinds of levels and access of different beauty products and stuff. And I think the other thing that has really impacted this younger generation is the whole wellness movement. So taking care of your skin, taking care of your body, making sure that you are, using good products, making sure that products are organic or that they are, BPA free. So all of those, I believe, has really upped the beauty game. It's not just about, makeup. It's becoming more about skincare and wellness.
Well, speaking of skincare, that's something, again, going back to my 8-year-old, she talks about skincare. She's like, I'm really into skincare. I'm like, well, you're 8 years old. Like, how are you into skincare? But, what's interesting is I had a bunch of her friends over for a party 2 or 3 months ago, and I was just sitting around the kitchen. And I asked them, I said, well, what do you all want to be when you grow up? And without fault, every single one of them said they want to be a YouTube influencer.
Of course.
And I think that's such an interesting sort of statement in terms of where society is focused right now. But I know that you actually have a former student of yours from FIT who actually got a degree at FIT and then went on, and now she's one of the biggest influencers out there, right?
That's right. Kate Barlett. She was one of my students. And we get a lot of students at FIT that want to be, quote unquote, stylists and influencers. So instead of telling students, oh no, you have to go the business route or you have to learn merchandising, you have to buying, Fashion Institute of Technology has done something great, which is writing curriculum to address the needs of the current market. How do you use social media to, enhance your brand? How do you become a stylist? So we've written courses, curriculum, how to be a stylist. We've written courses about, how do you use social media? We've written courses in marketing about how do you market your brand in the digital age. So we're actually leaning into that. So students that graduate are actually coming into the workforce with a wealth of experience on what is relevant today.
And she apparently has been very successful, right?
I think successful.
And does she still collaborate then with the university?
We've had her come back to do a few. She just did a talk last semester, maybe 2 semesters ago. She came and did a talk. So our alumni and I'm alumni also from FIT, in addition to teaching there. But the alumni are very connected to the college.
Do you feel that younger people, whether it's because of social media or any other influence, are they better storytellers than old fogies like you and me?
Definitely, no question about it. They are excellent storytellers.
What do you think accounts for that?
Well, I think part of it is, so Gen Alpha, believe it or not, is entering the workforce this year. So Gen Alpha is entering the workforce. Gen Alpha is the first generation that has literally been digitized since birth. So their whole life has been on camera, video, all of that. And that makes them very social in that aspect and very comfortable with storytelling. They're telling quick stories on Instagram. They're telling stories on TikTok. They're they're digital natives. So it's very easy for them to tell these quick stories. I think the challenge with that generation lies more in the critical thinking side of things. And of course, Gen Alpha, also known as the COVID kids, the socialization aspect, the interpersonal areas, probably something that will be a challenge for them.
Isn't that interesting that they're the first generation that's fully immersed in social media, yet they're also being criticized as the least social cohort.
Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, Shelley, it's been great having you on this inaugural episode of Leverage Storytelling.
Thank you so much for having me. And of course, I love reading all your stories too.
Well, we'll trade stories, swap stories.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Shelley.